Saul, the first king of ancient Israel, a man chosen by God to lead his chosen people from an earthly throne. In the land of the Bible, explore the rise and fall, the strengths and weaknesses of this earliest of Jewish monarchs. Saul, the king of promise, on this day of discovery. This is the land of the Bible, Israel, and Jerusalem, her spiritual capital. This city, like so many others in the region, was established on a cluster of hilltops. There, its ancient citizens could maintain military advantage over armies from hostile neighbors and the distant superpowers of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. Nearly every high place in the region was occupied by a city, a settlement, an altar, or a palace.
Jim, it's cold up here. Aren't you cold?
Not really. I've got a lot of insulation to take care of warming me up.
Yeah, what's down below here? Do you know?
Well, down in the valley, the red-roofed homes are a part of Piskat Zev, which is a Jewish community. And then across the highway to the flat-roofed homes over there, that would be an Arab community leading up to that little knoll where the pine trees are located. And beyond that would be the Dead Sea area.
And where we're standing, once again, we're standing on history. This is an ancient tell, a mound, but it was the home of King Saul, Gibeah of the Old Testament story. But there's another story to this site as well, a modern one.
There is. Jerusalem just to the west there, about 3 miles. This particular location of Gibeah, as you can see in the background, what was the beginnings of a palace. In the late 60s, just before the Six-Day War between the Arab countries and the state of Israel, King Hussein, the late king of Jordan, had come here and was going to build a palace. Jordan was actually controlling this piece of real estate before the Six-Day War. He started to build his palace. The war got underway, he had to stop it. So now we have an unfinished palace right here in Gibeah.
In some ways, Jim, it's almost as if it's a memorial set up to remind us of Saul, King Saul. And let's talk more about that as we take a look. The late King Hussein, who commissioned the building of this palace, ruled the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan for almost 50 years. At the time of his death in 1999, he was remembered for the friendship and peace that he eventually forged with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. But the windblown, unfinished remains of this palace reflect the conflict and controversies that tested his character and vision for the region. Time will write its own commentary on the historic significance of his reign, just as it has for Saul, the first king of Israel who held power and dreamed his own dreams on this same hilltop more than 3,000 years ago. How does history remember Saul? Well, physically, he was a man who stood head and shoulders above others. Spiritually, he was a small man in a big body. But you know, this empty shell of a palace really does remind me of a period of the nation of Israel's history. It was a difficult time. According to the Bible, the God of the people of Israel wanted them to look to him as their king. He wanted to be the provider and the protector, and he wanted his people to depend on him. And once in a while, it worked that way. But there came a period, it was the end of the time of the judges. And the man who had been leading the people of Israel on behalf of God, a man named Samuel, saw his age, and he appointed his sons to take his place. Well, according to the biblical text, the sons were not men of honor. They were corrupt men. They took bribes. They twisted justice, and the the people felt like they saw the handwriting on the wall. They came to Samuel and they insisted. They said, we've got to have another leader. They looked around, they saw the neighbor nations having kings leading them, taking them into battle. And they said, Samuel, we want a king like them. You can imagine that Samuel was disturbed. He knew what God's intent was. But he went to God and he asked him. And surprisingly, the God of Israel was ready to grant the request of his people. Talk more about that later. Let's continue to take a look around. As I think about the two kings linked to this windy hilltop, my thoughts go back to the days before Saul. For about 400 years, the people of Israel lived with no king but God. Instead, they were led by judges, people who were given divine wisdom and authority. But the descendants of Abraham, influenced by the human monarchies around them, demanded that they too have a king instead of a judge. Their high priest, Samuel, knew that God was displeased with their demand. And yet, even though the people of Israel were rejecting God as their king, through Samuel, the Lord of the heavens was patient with them. He gave them their request. God himself picked a big man, a powerful man by the name of Saul, son of a highly respected leader whose home may very well have stood on this land beneath our feet. Through Samuel, the Lord assured his people that if their new king remained obedient to the commands of God, they could still experience heaven's favor.
Then Samuel said to the people, "Do not fear. You have done all this wickedness, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Only fear the Lord, and serve him in truth with all your heart. For consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king." 1 Samuel chapter 12.
Indeed, King Saul was head and shoulders above all the men of Israel. The Old Testament writers tell us he was a very handsome man and a very successful general. In fact, after he was anointed by the prophet priest Samuel, he led the nation of Israel against the Ammonites. He was victorious. And at Gilgal in the Jordan Valley, King Saul was recognized by the people as a king. He would have confrontations with other nations like the Philistines and even the Amalekites, but not quite as victorious in these two different confrontations between the other nations.
Saul did have a good start. When Samuel anointed him, the text says the Spirit of God came upon Saul and changed his heart. In fact, his neighbors were amazed. They saw Saul with the other prophets begin to prophesy in behalf of God. And they said, is it possible? Is Saul now to be named among the prophets? And yet, the good start that Saul had didn't last long.
And as the reign of King Saul continued, it was a time when the first king of Israel started to compromise. In fact, he was even disobedient. Disobedient to the extent that the Spirit of the Lord departed from him. An evil spirit came upon him. This began a time of mental agony for Saul, physical distress. In fact, his staff called for someone to come and try to soothe him both mentally and physically by playing a harp. They found a shepherd boy near Gibeah in Bethlehem, a young boy named David.
Even though David faithfully served Saul by playing music to calm the king's tormented soul and by leading in battle to defeat the nation's enemies, Saul could not accept that God had chosen David as successor. And from that time forward, Saul's life would be marked by self-protection rather than by protecting the people entrusted to him. King Saul's desire to survive and to protect his power became an obsession. Repeatedly, he tried to kill David and even led armed men through the Judean wilderness in an attempt to kill the one that he regarded as a threat. To get a feel for the region through which Saul pursued David, we drove down through the Judean wilderness, from the heights of Gibeah down toward the Dead Sea, into the same wilderness that so often concealed David and his men from the army of King Saul. Along the way, we spotted some mountain bikers risking life and limb, chasing a thrill on rugged tracks that crisscrossed the rough terrain. The trails they descended seemed to us like a visual metaphor of the downward spiral of Israel's first king. We caught up with some of them at a rest area at the foot of the Judean wilderness and asked them about their equipment and what it takes to survive in this rugged terrain.
Okay, so, and you've already been riding today.
Yes.
How'd it go?
Fine.
Did you fall at
No
all?
one was injured. No.
Nobody injured.
No.
So successful day, right?
Is that normally the case, that you can come through with no injuries, or do you sometimes get hurt?
We're quite cowards.
Yeah,
You're
no,
coward. I would be as well. I can appreciate that.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm going to enjoy your sport from a distance, man. Thanks for,
Yes.
yeah, good
Enjoy
meeting
Israel.
you. Now, are you
Thank
done,
you
are
so
you done
much.
for today?
Nice to meet
Are you
you.
done
Yes,
for today?
we're done
All right,
for today.
okay.
Yes.
All right.
Thanks for taking a moment
Stay safe,
with us.
all right?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Good.
It was into a region like this that the shepherd boy David would run as he was fleeing King Saul. He had been there in the palace of King Saul in Gibeah. He played the harp, comforted the heart of the king. He would return to Bethlehem, his hometown, and Jesse, his father, would give him some supplies to take to his brothers who were in battle against the Philistines. As he arrived on the scene, Goliath, the leader of the Philistines, the giant, would have confronted him. David would have picked up a stone, maybe a little bit larger than this, smooth because it was in the brook. With the use of his slingshot, would kill the giant, and then in fact lead the army of Israel against the Philistines and push them back into the coastal plains of the land. It was after that that the women of Israel would start to sing about Saul, who had killed his thousands, but David, the shepherd boy, would kill his tens of thousands. And upon hearing that, King Saul would become very jealous. He would start chasing this young man, a shepherd boy who was destined to be the king. And David would flee here into this region to the south of us to a place called En-Gedi, and there hide from King Saul.
David made haste to get away from Saul, for Saul and his men were encircling David and his men to take them. But a messenger came to Saul, saying, "Hasten and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land." Therefore Saul returned from pursuing David and went against the Philistines. So they called that place the Rock of Escaping. Then David went up from there and dwelt in strongholds at En-Gedi. 1 Samuel chapter 23.
You can see why David would have sought out En-Gedi. He found a place of retreat in the caves and the shadows. In fact, when you're down here in the Judean wilderness, you realize why people would value the shade of a tamarisk tree so much. In fact, I'm gonna take advantage of that right now. The story of Saul chasing David into this region is a pretty compelling one. Here was the man, the first king of Israel. Started well. God changed his heart. God gave him strength. God gave him victory over the Philistines until David comes along. Now David begins to get the honor and Saul becomes envious. And Saul begins to make some compromises. You know, when I read the text, I at times I feel like God is getting Saul in a technicality. His disobedience in the beginning doesn't seem all that great by our standards. And I think to myself, wow, Lord, you just made him king, and now he steps over the line just a little bit, and you reprimand him. In fact, you tell him he's not going to be king very long. That's the way the biblical text reads, until you get to the place where Saul is chasing David down into this region. And then you continue to read, and all of a sudden you realize you're watching a man who's a little bit like that shell of a palace that we talked about up at Gibeah. Here's a big man, head and shoulders above the other men of the community. But it's like he's full of rage, he's full of envy, jealousy. Over and over again now, he begins to do things that show that there's little honor left. Everything is turned into self-protection. He started out serving the cause, and now he's trying to make the cause serve him. Over and over again, Saul tries to manipulate situations. He gives his daughter Michal to David, hoping that that relationship will entangle David. He sends David off to war against the Philistines, hoping that David will be killed by the Philistines. Then when his son Jonathan says, Dad, what are you doing? Why are you trying to kill David? He hasn't done anything against you. He says, okay, no, I promise before the Lord God, I will not harm him. Keep reading, and all of a sudden, Saul is full of rage, and he's doing anything he can do to try to kill this young man who he views as a threat to his throne. And in so many ways, Saul quickly turns into a shell of a man, a hulk of a man, but there's no character, there's no strength of spirit, which is what the God of Israel was looking for and what he found in David.
Saul had so much promise, son of a powerful man, handsome, tall, confident, and at one point filled with the Spirit of God. The narrative of Saul begins like a fairy tale, but it ends as a tragedy. It seems fitting that ruins would again continue telling the sad story.
Yeah. So this is one of the 10, right? One of the 10 Roman cities.
The Decapolis cities.
Yeah.
Talked about in the Old Testament and the New Testament. In fact, down below me here, in the foreground, would be the Decapolis city, archaeological remains of the Roman city. And then in the background, the tell, the mound, which is the Old Testament Bet-Shan. It was to the southwest of us here, in the mountains of Gilboa, that King Saul would have met defeat and then ultimately his death. The Israelites were fleeing from the Philistines. Philistines overtook them, killed most of his men. King Saul realized that the end was near. Went to his armor bearer, asked him to take out a sword and kill him before the Philistines came upon him and would torture him, abuse his body. His armor bearer refused to do that out of fear. And so King Saul took the sword and fell upon the sword and killed himself. His armor bearer followed suit, killing himself as well. 3 of the 4 sons of King Saul had been killed. And the next day, as the Philistines came among the bodies of the dead Israelites, they found the 3 sons of Saul and the king himself. Cut their heads off, took their armor back to the temple of their gods and placed the armor there, left the bodies there in the field. They took the bodies and then came here to Bet-Shan and attached those bodies to the walls of the city. Some of the soldiers of the Israelites, King Saul's soldiers over in Jabesh Gilead, heard about the defeat of King Saul, his death. They came here to the city of Bet-Shan, took his body and the sons' bodies off of the walls, went back across the Jordan River into Jabesh Gilead. There they burned the bodies and buried the bones in Jabesh Gilead.
While the story of King Saul ends with an account of his military defeat, we know that his real downfall had come much earlier.
Saul had begun so well. God chose him to serve the kingdom of heaven. But although he began serving the cause of God, Saul came to the point where he tried to make the cause serve him. Before the battle that would take his life, we read how far Saul had fallen from the God who had chosen him to be the first king of Israel.
Now Samuel had died, and all Israel had lamented for him, and buried him in Ramah, in his own city. And Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. Then the Philistines gathered together, and came and encamped at Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel together, and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams, or by Urim, or by the prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servants said to him, "In fact, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor." 1 Samuel chapter 28.
We've come to a spot that is about 2.5 miles to the south of Mount Tabor. And just behind me, the palm trees represent the traditional site of Endor. According to the Bible, King Saul visited Endor the day before he died. It was a desperate act. Earlier in his life, Saul had kicked out of Israel all of the spiritists and the mediums. He did this in obedience to the law of his God. But now the Philistine armies were camped just on the other side of that mountain right there. The king was frightened. He didn't know what to do. Samuel, his counselor, his spiritual advisor, was dead. And Saul felt like he had to get answers. And even though he had kicked out of the land the spiritists and mediums, he began to ask, "Does anyone know where I can find someone who can conjure up the spirits?" And he was told about a woman that lived here at Endor. And so in the middle of the night, he disguised himself. He made his way around the Philistines, and he came here to Endor. But when he left, he was shaken. He learned that within a day, he and his sons would die. They would die because of a pattern of unfaithfulness that had marked this king. What do we learn from the life of the first king of Israel? What do we learn from King Saul? Oh, we learn a lot of things. One thing is that when individuals of unusual strength and stature let us down, when they betray our trust, it shows our need for someone greater. We see this not only in the life of Saul, but in all of the kings that followed him, until another king came into Jerusalem, declaring himself to be the one perfect king. The crowds believed he was the long-awaited Messiah. But in the days to follow, his life turned. Suddenly, he had died. His followers had fled. Now they were in distress. Until 3 days later, he reappeared to them. It was all in fulfillment of this unfolding story of God, this great story of the Bible. And as we look back now at both Testaments, we're in a position to see what happened. The one great God of the Old Testament, the King of the universe, had used the kings of Israel to show us our need of a greater king. And that perfect king came. He showed how much he loved us. He died for us. He paid for our wrongs. And then he rose again from the dead to rescue and to offer forgiveness to anyone who would put their trust in him.
So will we trust the King who stood in such contrast to Saul, the one who, according to the New Testament, was in very nature God, but did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross.
Therefore God exalted him to the highest place, and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.